Hello, everyone, and welcome to another MRMIA broadcast. I am your host, Marc Leprince, and today we have a special edition with Dr. John Hill, an adjunct professor at NYU Tandon. And today, instead of our usual format where we kind of banter about interview questions, John Hill has given us a special treat where he's going to go over a longer format presentation on the history of model risk. So, John, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? And then when you're ready, feel free to present your slides.
Okay, so as Marc said, I'm an adjunct professor at New York NYU Tandon. I have over 20 years of experience in model risk, various forms of model risk management and governance at 3 or 4 leading investment banks. But right now I'm working as a consultant and I'm teaching at NYU. The first graduate level class I think that's ever been presented in model risk management. And the presentation I'm about to give here is the one that I use as an introduction in this course, because I discovered that graduate students in quantitative finance know a great deal about options theory, stochastic processes, econometrics, et cetera, knew absolutely nothing about model risk. This was a completely new topic for them. So I prepared this presentation as a way of showing them that it's not just relevant to finance, it's relevant to almost every area of human activity. And I do that by showing very recognizable examples of clear model risk consequences from areas that have nothing to do with finance. It covers aviation, space flight. You'll see examples. Some of them are humorous, some of them are terrifying, including one example in which a modeling error nearly caused a nuclear holocaust. And if that doesn't convince everyone that model risk is important, then nothing will. So with that introduction, this is the introductory class for my graduate course in model risk management to explain why model risk is really important and why I think it'll become ever more so as we progress with our technology into the future. The title of my presentation is The Long and Curious History of Model Risk, and I think by the end of it, you'll agree it is both long and certainly curious in many cases. I've developed this presentation, as I said, for a graduate course that I teach in model risk management to introduce students to the importance of model risk, something that just isn't being taught right now in schools of finance anywhere that I've been able to determine. So I'm an adjunct professor of financial risk engineering, as Marc said earlier, and this is my introduction to model risk. So why should we even care about model risk? And my answer is it's not limited just to finance, although that's where it's probably best recognized. A brief romp through history is going to reveal some surprising and unexpected examples of model risk that have appeared in very different areas of human activity. So here's my prelude. Over the next 30 or 40 minutes, this presentation will span 400 years and traverse half the globe in search of historical narratives on model risk based on actual incidents. Most of the examples will be unfamiliar to you. Some you may have heard of. Some are terrifying and a few are even funny, but all are factual. They actually did occur, and you can do research on them, as I have, to prove it. Along the way, we'll hopefully gain a renewed appreciation of model risk and the role that it has played in human affairs throughout our history. In order to do that, this abbreviated history, I say abbreviated because there are a lot more examples. This is the short version. We're going to start in Stockholm, Sweden, 1626 to 1628. And we're going to travel all the way to Mars. One example will be 30,000 feet above the surface of Mars from 1999. And we'll make the following stops along the way. Stockholm, Sweden, the British Royal Navy in the Falkland Islands in 1914. NORAD headquarters in 1960, the British Royal Navy in the Falkland Islands again in 1982, where they repeated the same blunder they made in 1914. The US Navy in the 1990s, not to be outdone by the British Royal Navy, they actually had an even sillier blunder that I only learned of fairly recently. Then we'll go to Roundstone Bay in County Galway, Ireland, circa 2004 for a fairly humorous example of model risk. We're going to visit the Spanish Navy in 2013, the boat that wouldn't float, and the Boeing 737 MAX air disasters in Indonesia and Ethiopia in 2018 and 19. And then, as I said, we'll land on Mars in 1999. I want to start with probably the best known and most relevant quotation about model risk. This is from George Box, who was writing about response surfaces in 1987. He said, "Remember that all models are wrong. The practical question is how wrong do they have to be to not be useful?" And this is critical understanding of models, because what he's saying is model risk can never be eliminated. Because all models are wrong at some certain level of precision, for example, Newtonian physics is used all the time for ballistics calculations and space flight, but it is wrong at relativistic speeds. All models possess inherent systemic risk. This type of risk can be mitigated with rigorous model discipline, but it can never be entirely eliminated. So here's my first example. Let's move to Stockholm, Sweden, August 10th of 1628, where we're going to find a very early example of very recognizable model risk. On that day, the biggest, baddest, and most powerful warship of its time, called the Vasa, was launched in Stockholm Harbor in full view of thousands of proud, cheering Swedes. This ship was the mightiest warship and most heavily armed ever attempted up to that time. It was intended to win naval domination over all of the Baltic nations for Sweden. Sweden was quite a small country, but they had advanced shipbuilding skills, and they knew if they ruled the seas, they could be a dominant power. So the Vasa was under construction, overseen by Dutch master shipwrights from 1626 to 1628, 2 years in construction at a cost of today's dollars of probably several hundred million. It was funded and mandated by King Gustavus Adolphus the Great of Sweden. He commissioned this construction to ensure dominance, as I said, over all other European navies of the day. The Vasa took 2 years to build at a high cost. On the morning of August 10th, 1628, it was towed into Stockholm Harbor. There, she unfurled her sails for the open seas and fired off a broadside salute, which turned out to be a farewell salute. She caught a light morning breeze and promptly heeled over onto her port side and sank. Within an hour of launch, the pride of the Swedish Navy rested on the bottom, along with some 50 of her unfortunate crew. The Vasa had fallen victim to a form of modeling error that, in the right perspective, is very recognizable today. The captain survived, by the way, but some of the 50 crew members who were trapped below deck did not. What kind of model error could sink such a large, heavily armed ship? Well, for over 300 years, the cause of the Vasa disaster remains a mystery until the 1960s. And that's when marine archaeologists discovered the hull was still resting on the bottom of Stockholm Harbor and remarkably intact due to the very cold water conditions that preserved the wooden vessel. So over several years, the Vasa was carefully raised from the sea bottom and returned to a location near its original construction site. And this is a photograph of the Vasa as it was raised from the ocean bottom. As you can see, it was completely intact. It was painstakingly restored by the Swedish government. It's now a genuine 17th century ghost ship. This is housed in a large hangar near Stockholm Harbor, very close to where it was constructed. If any of you ever go to Stockholm, I highly recommend visiting the Vasa Museum, because it's the closest thing you'll ever get to a true ghost ship. From this, it looks today as if it just sailed right out of the 17th century. It's been lovingly restored, including with all the rigging. Unfortunately, you're not allowed to go inside. But what kind of model error could have sunk such a heavy armed warship? Because the hull was preserved intact, marine archaeologists and architects were able to determine why the Vasa had capsized so readily, and it was pretty simple. It had less than half the ballast that a ship of its displacement, which was about 1,200 tons, and weight distribution should have had, only half the correct amount of ballast. The Vasa was over twice as heavy as any ship previously constructed. So the shipbuilders were in an unknown domain of shipbuilding and estimating ballast. The necessary ballast for its size, which is this red line, was nearly twice the correct amount mount that was actually found in the hull. So if you see this convex curve above in red, that is how the required ballast changes as a function of displacement. And those black dots over to the left show previous constructions that the shipbuilders were familiar with of ships about half the size of the Vasa. So what they did was the only thing they could do at that time. This was about 75 years before Newton published his Mathematica Principia. So calculus was unknown. There was no way of calculating what we call today the writing moment, which is a very complex calculation to perform. So the shipwrights did the only thing they could do. They used linear extrapolation. Now, if you're familiar with this area of quantitative analysis, you know that extrapolation on a convex curve is very error prone. Interpolation between known data points, at least you know that the data points will be correct. But when you extrapolate unknown territory, you're put at risk of having a large error. And in this case, that is why the Vasa had only half the ballast it should have had. But who was really to blame? It wasn't just the fact that the Vasa didn't have enough ballast. Good King Adolphus, who actually was, by most accounts, a good king, he is partly responsible because he kept changing the requirements for this ship during construction. And he did that by insisting on adding extra heavy cannons, the largest that the Swedish foundries could make, on the top deck. They put it on the top deck because they were too big to fit below decks. Rushed the production schedule while he was leading the Swedish army in northern Germany against the French impulse. So he was constantly sending messages back to his shipbuilders and admirals, get the Vasa in the water now. Does this ring a bell with anybody who's ever been put on a rush project and told to get the thing into production, get that model finished, put it into production, the traders need it now? Same psychology here. Under great pressure from the king to get the boat in the water because he needed it right away. So the first shipwright, this is a Dutch master. He's also responsible because he was irresponsible and dying midway through construction. That was really thoughtless of him. The shipbuilder, Henrik Jacobsen, also was responsible because he didn't replace the shipwright when he became ill. Now, this is the best part. The vice admiral of the Swedish fleet, named Claes Fleming, he knew perfectly well the ship was unstable, and he still allowed the launch of the ship. He knew it would never survive the open seas. And the reason he knew this is that he had performed the 17th century equivalent of what we would call a stress test today. And they did that in those days for ships by getting, say, 50 sailors on deck, getting them all on one side of the ship, then having them all run to the other side, then back to the first side, and back and forth to get the ship rocking, just the way you would rock a rowboat by shifting your weight from one foot to the other while you're standing. And any experienced seaman, or certainly admiral of the Swedish Navy, would be able to judge how quickly the ship came to the upright position, whether or not it would be seaworthy. They had a good sense of how quickly it should right itself. So the record actually showed that the admiral was so upset by how slowly the Vasa righted itself that he canceled the test. But then he did nothing. He just said, well, we'll just let it be. No sense bringing bad news to the king because he's not in a good mood to begin with. And then the captain of the ship, because he agreed to the launch of an unstable ship, and then he opened the lower deck gun ports for a 20-gun salute. I mean, what was he thinking? Well, the full story of the Vasa is well documented, and it's used in many business stories. They actually had a full inquest, what we call a court-martial today, the Privy Council, and all the officers and crewmen in question, and everybody insisted that they did exactly what they were supposed to do, and they had all done it correctly. The bows were properly stowed, the guns were properly secured. No one stepped forward to take the blame. Does that surprise anyone today? Notice on my left, I have this quote, which is fairly famous: "Success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan." That's attributed to Count Calasio Ciano, who was an Italian diplomat and son-in-law of Mussolini. But success has many fathers, failure is an orphan. No one wants to own a failure. So the crewmen and contractors formed two camps. They tried to blame each other, and everyone swore they had done everything they were supposed to do. In the end, since no guilty party could be identified, they did what I think to be the very ethical and logical thing. They decided to blame the dead guy, the Master Henrik Hybertson, who had very conveniently died midway through construction. So no heads rolled. And in fact, Sweden went on to build three more ships of this size, and they got the ballast right after this painful example. But the story leaves open one very obvious question that no one in the Admiral's Navy inquest seems to have pursued. If Vice Admiral Fleming knew the Vasa was dangerously unstable, why did he ever let it go to sea? And my answer is, dead men tell no tales. It's the 17th century equivalent of sweeping one's mistakes under the carpet. He obviously assumed that the Vasa would make it out of Stockholm Harbor, and that once it hit any kind of rough weather, it would just capsize and sink, and everyone would assume it fell to enemy action, and no one would be the wiser. It was a way of sweeping these mistakes under the carpet. King Adolphus later was killed in Saxony in 1632 while leading his army against the Papists. He wasn't a bad king, and he wasn't a tyrant. No one was really punished for the Vasa incident because I think he recognized his own culpability. In fact, Napoleon considered him to be the greatest military leader of the 17th century. Now, Wikipedia has a great essay, a series of articles on the Vasa if you want to read it. Also, a number of books have been written about it. So this is a pretty well-known affair. So let's move now from the Vasa forward a few centuries. To the Falkland Islands, December 17th, 1914. This is concerns a forgotten engagement of a nearly forgotten war, the very beginning of World War I. But there were actually naval engagements during World War I in the South Atlantic. In this case, a British Royal Navy fleet from Norfolk had arrived at the Falkland Islands coaling station in the South Atlantic on December 7th in response to some activity by German raiding squadrons. But almost immediately, the British ships became engaged in complex maneuvers with an opposing fleet of German warships who just happened to arrive the very next morning after the British ships arrived. British gunnery officers are stupefied to see their long-range shells dropping into the ocean far from the German warships. Their ballistic tables that they use for aiming long-distance artillery seem to be seriously flawed. This was a textbook example of modeling error, one that nearly resulted in disaster for the BRN. The BRN deflection tables that were intended to correct for the Coriolis effect had been calculated under the rather curious assumption that naval engagements would only occur in the Northern Hemisphere. I'll explain what the Coriolis effect is in the next slide. But the British gunnery officers had apparently forgotten that the Coriolis effect is reversed in the Southern Hemisphere. So they were making their corrections in the wrong direction, which doubled the error. So what is the Coriolis effect? Well, if you imagine that you're, say, on a carousel, like the one diagrammed here, and you try to throw a ball, say a tennis ball or ping pong ball, to someone on the opposite side of the carousel while you're rotating, you're going to find it devilishly difficult to get the ball to the intended target because it will appear to curve, to move in a curve, depending on how fast the rotation is and how far you're throwing it. Whereas viewed from directly above, the ball moves in a straight line, according to the laws of physics. Why is this happening? Because the frame of reference is rotating. Well, the Earth is nothing more than a three-dimensional carousel. And in the Northern Hemisphere, all long-range projectiles will therefore curve to the right of their aiming point, regardless of direction or wind conditions. It's not noticeable over short distances. So if you're throwing a baseball in your backyard, you'd never notice Coriolis effect. But if you could throw a baseball 20 miles, then you would notice that it always fell to the right of your aiming point in the Northern Hemisphere. The effect, but in the Southern Hemisphere, the effect is absolutely reverse in the same way that whirlpools move in the opposite direction in the Southern Hemisphere. This was a French physicist who named Gaspard Gustav Coriolis who first understood and explained this effect in 1835, and all artillery officers were equipped with tables that allowed them, given their latitude and direction, allowed them to deflect their aiming point to correct for this. So in the age of the Vasa naval engagements, they were fought at ranges of a few hundred yards. The Coriolis effect was negligible. But In 1914, these artillery shells could travel over 20 miles, and then it became quite substantial. So I want to put this in a more contemporary perspective. During a period of very high volatility, the British failed to recalibrate their models to local market conditions. It's a classic modeling error. And what's amazing is what happened again in 1982. We'll get to that later. Okay, if this example now takes us to NORAD headquarters in Colorado Springs in 1960. And if this example does not convince you of the importance of model risk, then nothing will, and I give up. This is a really frightening example, actually. That's the tunnel leading into Cheyenne Mountain, which is where the NORAD headquarters are burrowed in miles underground to protect them from any kind of nuclear attack. In 1960, a critical computer at US military's NORAD command suddenly issued a warning and said there was an imminent barrage of nuclear missiles coming from USSR based on a computer analysis of strong echo returns reported by the radar base in Thule, Greenland. That's why Greenland is so important, by the way. We have an early warning radar system set up in the north of Greenland. Hundreds of millions of lives were held in the balance of what was going to happen within just the next few minutes, because the computer was warning impact was about 10 minutes away. So this is the Thule Air Force Base, and a strong return were detected by US radar operating at this base in 1960. So based on that radar data, the computer said that with 99% certainty, the USSR had just launched a surprise nuclear attack. Now, those commanders in charge had only a few minutes to decide whether or not to notify the president, at that time was Dwight Eisenhower, that we were about to receive a nuclear holocaust from Russia, and he would have to decide whether or not to launch a counterattack before it was too late. So you can imagine the level of stress that these commanders were under, whether to advise the president that we were about to be attacked with a nuclear barrage, or whether to suspect that maybe the computer could be wrong. After all, it was 1960 and computer models were very new at that time. Well, luckily for us, the commanders knew something that the computer, in fact, no AI program probably would have known at the time, which was, as it happened, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the Soviet premier at that time, was actually in New York City at the United Nations that very week, banging his shoe on the table. And so they put that together and said, they're premiers in New York. They're not likely to be launching a nuclear attack while he's there, of course, unless they want to get rid of him. But they also knew something else through intelligence. They knew at that time the USSR had less than a dozen fully functional ICBMs. And this was reporting a major barrage. So they made the wise decision to wait for impact, not to notify the president in advance. So 100 million lives depended on this decision. So fortunately for all of us, as I said, these level-headed officers decided to override the computer model. They reasoned, as I said, that they were not likely to launch an attack while the Russian premier was in New York. So what caused this? It was the moon rising over Norway. Radar echoes had bounced back from the moon as it was rising over Norway and were misinterpreted by the echo analysis software as a massive barrage coming from the direction of Siberia. Now, this is a classic case of the things you don't even know, you don't know about that really come back to bite you in the end. No one had ever imagined that the radar would go all the way to the moon and bounce back and be misinterpreted as a massive return echo coming from Siberia. This is classic modeling error of oversight. And this is one on which 100 million lives or more probably hung in the balance. And we should be very grateful that those NORAD commanders kept their cool and collected their senses together and reasoned that this is not the kind of attack we would expect from Russia. There have been other incidents along this line. I haven't documented them here, but the Russians have also had their false alarms. In one case, a weather rocket was launched from Norway just up into the stratosphere, and the Russian radar misinterpreted that as a nuclear missile too. But the Russians also held their fire for similar reasons. This one has been well publicized, this example. We probably will never know how many other occurrences there have been of near misses due to modeling error. because they don't tend to get published. Like this example didn't get published. So I mentioned we'd come back to the Falkland Islands again. So those of you who are old enough may remember the Falkland Islands War of 1982 between Britain and Argentina, when once again, Britain rushed its naval fleet down to the Falkland Islands, which was a critical fueling station for the British Royal Navy because the Argentinians were trying to invade it. And believe it or not, the BRN made the same mistake 68 years later, this time during that brief conflict. Now, I put up on the upper right hand of this slide, I think a very relevant quote: "Those who don't know their history are destined to repeat it." This is attributed to Edmund Burke, a 19th century British statesman. And I don't think there's any better example than this one, only it was much worse in 1982. In 1914, once the artillery officers realized what had happened, they could just reverse the deflection that was indicated by their tables, and they'd get approximately into the right direction. But in 1982, all of these calculations for the Coriolis effect were embedded in what is called assembler code that were used on the relatively primitive computers of that era. I know this only by complete serendipity. This incident has never been published. You will never read about it anywhere. And I'm pretty sure there are about only 6 living people today, 6 people alive today who have firsthand knowledge of this. And it was my good fortune to have one of those 6 people attend a master class that I taught on model risk about 7 years ago in London as an English mathematician physicist. And I mentioned the 1914 incident because I'd heard about that from my physics teacher. And when I told him about that, his jaw dropped open. He came up to me later and he said, "I didn't know about 1914. I can tell you it happened again in 1982 because I was a graduate student sharing an office with all these programmers who were put on a 24/7 emergency rotation to go through hundreds of thousands of lines of assembler code, changing +1s to -1s to correct the Coriolis calculation for the Southern Hemisphere." Same mistake, only this time it was hard-coded in a much more difficult way to change. Assembler code is not like the languages we're familiar with, the 3rd and 4th and 5th generation languages, where you can just change a single global variable and it gets changed everywhere. In assembler, there are no global variables, there are no data arrays, there are only memory addresses and operations. That's what the computer understands. So these programmers had to go through every single line of this assembler code, changing pluses to minuses. It was then punched onto paper tape. That's what they used in those days because it was impervious to radiation, and had to be flown down to the Falklands and installed on all the ships that use the navigational software. The fellow who told me this is named Alan Forrest. He's a quant working for Virgin Finance right now. And he told me that if they hadn't made that change, those Harrier jets would have been landing in the ocean instead of on the carrier decks, among other outrages that might have occurred. So this was, to me, these are some of my favorite examples because it shows that we keep making the same mistakes over and over again because we really don't change. Well, now, believe it or not, now the American Navy made a similar mistake in the 1990s, one that was, if anything, even more embarrassing than the BRN's twin follies. As in 1982 for the BRN, a plus-minus sign error was embedded within the navigation software used by F-18A Hornet jet fighters that were deployed on the US aircraft carriers at that time. An error that only became apparent south of the equator. There's these wonderful examples of things that work in the Northern Hemisphere and they don't work in the Southern Hemisphere. And it's a perfect example of a model that works for one application, doesn't necessarily work for another application that seems similar, but really isn't the same. This is one of the sources of modeling error, of misapplying a model that was developed for one application, thinking it should work for another. So what happened? It wasn't the same error, though, that the BRN had made. It was actually simpler. And I only learned about this one last April, April 13th. I saw an article in the New York Times that was really discussing the improvements in software that was made for space flight. And there was a quotation from a retired US Navy admiral named Joseph Dyer. And I'm quoting this directly from the New York Times. Mr. Dyer recalled an upgrade to the computer software on the airplanes. It worked perfectly in the Northern Hemisphere, but the first time an aircraft carrier took the FA-18s below the equator, it was discovered there was a plus sign in the computer code that should have been a minus sign. And as soon as I saw that, I said, wonderful. Another example of the Coriolis gremlin. Again, I have to repeat my statement. Those who do not know their history are destined to repeat it. But it turns out it actually was even simpler. Mr. Dyer wrote back to me. I was able to contact him via LinkedIn and asked him, was this the Coriolis gremlin again? And he wrote back and said, I'd be happy if it had been that sophisticated. In fact, it was much simpler. Rather than subtracting latitude south of the equator, the code added. That, coupled with velocity vector calculations and Kalman filtering the navigation calculation, completely blew up. In other words, the programmer didn't realize that latitudes below the equator are indicated with minus. It's minus 10, minus 20 degrees, and above the equator with plus. And this leads to a more interesting observation I have made many times, that very often people who are really good at software, expert coders, can often be very clueless about the application, the purpose of the application. They're actually coding, and they don't have a basic physical understanding of it, and couldn't catch such a basic error like this. I'm sure the programmer wrote really good code because it ought to be part of a real-time operating system that can't crash. And yet, when the pilots of these planes got into the Southern Hemisphere, they realized the navigational system was completely useless. So in effect, if they were operating off the coast of Chile, the navigation system was saying, no, you're really in the Caribbean. Okay, human pilots would know right away something was wrong because they have a pretty good idea where they were. But imagine if this same mistake was made in a cruise missile software. And I don't know if it was or not, but then you'd have cruise missiles going around in circles or striking completely the wrong target because they wouldn't have enough sense to know that they were in the wrong hemisphere for what the navigation system was telling them. So it was easily recognized by the pilots, as I said, but it's another case of those not knowing their history are destined to repeat it. Okay, so here's actually a fairly humorous example. This is from Roundstone Bay, Galway, Ireland, which is on the west coast of Ireland in 2004. Now, sometimes the risk is actually in the input. Now, some of you may have seen this sequence on the internet, but it's really interesting. So a driver had forgotten to engage his handbrake, and his parked car rolled off the quay into Roundstone Bay on the west coast of Ireland. And if you look at the lower left-hand corner, you'll see someone standing on an upside-down car with just two wheels sticking out of the water. That's the vehicle that had rolled into the water. And the owner has obviously called a truck with a boom to come and lift his car back out of the water. So this crane operator got a diver, attached a belt to the car so he could haul it back. You just got a diver to attach the cable and start to lift. Now, if you know how these crane operators operate or how they work, they will have a table or perhaps a computer program today that tells them, given the extension of that boom and the extension of the outrigger legs, they know how much weight they can lift. So let's assume the operator, and that's the guy standing just in front of the truck, the operator knew the weight of that car, and he knew how much he had to extend the boom and the outrigger legs for the weight of the car. But the question is, did he also consider the weight of the water inside the car? A cubic yard of seawater weighs nearly 1,800 pounds, and this car could easily be holding that much water as he was lifting it. Well, let's have a look. Oops. Erroneous data input is another form of model risk that can make for a really bad day if you don't pay attention. And now you can see the driver in that red jacket saying, oh my God, that's the end of my job. Okay, so modeling lesson here is never a good idea to underestimate model input, and they probably should have called for a bigger crane. So that's exactly what they did. So let's call on the operators with a really, really big truck. And this operator knows his business. He has no trouble lifting that white car. It's Michael Long. It's a much bigger truck with a much larger boom. And you can see the outrigger legs are pushed way out. So they get the car out of the drink. And then he says, well, maybe we can bail out this other crane operator and go back and lift his rig too. And this big truck certainly seems to be up to the job. So let's see how he does. Whoa. Well, this proves once again that no good deed goes unpunished. Or as Mark Twain noted, history may not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. All right, let's take model risk to Mars now. In 1998, NASA launched the Mars Climate Orbiter. It was a 750-pound robotic space probe that cost about $157 million to design and build. And it was designed to orbit Mars and report on the climate in the Martian atmosphere. 10 months later, the orbiter approached the red planet. It began its program spiraling elliptical descents into high orbit. It entered the upper Martian atmosphere at 30,000 miles per hour. Remember, it was supposed to stay just above the Martian atmosphere, and promptly burned and disintegrated, crashed into the Martian surface. And the failure here, it was a failure to convert metric thrust calculations into English units. It turned out that the ballistic calculations were done in one system and the thrust calculations were done in the other system, and somebody forgot to do the conversion. So this orbiter dove far too deeply into the Martian atmosphere, and even though it's thin by our standards, at 30,000 miles an hour, the robotic spacecraft was not designed to take that kind of stress and just flamed out. Okay, this is another one that I think is actually fairly humorous, and it's nice because, again, no lives were lost. This is the, here I say model risk goes underwater, goes underseas. It's the sad tale of a little boat that couldn't. The Spanish Navy's S-81 Isaac Peral state-of-the-art diesel electric submarine cost $680 million to develop and build. And completed in 2013, it was a sophisticated high-tech boat that nevertheless couldn't float. The completed S-81 was discovered to be 75 to 100 tons overweight due to a decimal place error in the software used to calculate buoyancy. As designed, it could submerge once, but it would never resurface. Oops. Naval engineers would determine that the only practical remedy would be to lengthen the vessel at an additional cost of about $100 million. And fortunately for the prospective crew, this error was realized before the little boat ever set sail. This is a well-documented event too, and one we can all laugh at, except maybe the Spanish Navy, which is kind of interesting as an historical note. The Spanish Navy actually produced the first practical working electric submarine in the 1880s, about 15 to 20 years before Germany, America, and England did the same thing. So they were real pioneers in that field. So this had to be a huge embarrassment for them. This one is a real tragedy. Now, everybody has read about this, the preventable tragedy of the Boeing 737 MAX airliner in 2018, 2019. Boeing introduced this new fuel-efficient jet in 2017 and had it certified for airworthiness. It was used by bought. There were many, many orders for this plane because it promised to reduce fuel and operating costs for the planes. And tragedy struck when the Lion Air 737 MAX crashed in the Indian Ocean in October of 2018. I'm sure most people have read about this incident because the pilots discovered that something was forcing the plane into a nosedive, and there was nothing they could do to override it. After this accident, there was a lot of press and a lot of publicity, and I distinctly remember the CEO of Boeing at that time going on global or national and global television, telling everyone that he had complete confidence in the safety of this plane. Well, he's a businessman. What else is he going to say? Don't fly on this plane anymore. In fact, they should have grounded it at that point. The FAA failed, and so did Boeing, because only about 6 months later, another plane, an Ethiopian Air, crashed in exactly the same way. And the ground 4 months later also went into an uncontrollable nosedive. So I'm going to actually explain a little bit of how that happened, and you'll find that modeling error was behind all of this. So the fault was traced back to a faulty, what's called an AOA, angle of attack sensor. And that combined with a series modeling error in the MCAS avionics software was found to be the cause of these two deadly crashes. MCAS was a software that was installed on these planes without the knowledge of the FAA or of any of the pilots who were flying the planes. It was almost a secret service piece of software that was designed to prevent stalls. And the reason for that is the engines on this plane, to increase fuel efficiency and fit larger engines, the engineers had to move the two jet engines farther forward on the wings. And this would tend to cause the nose to lift. And they were so concerned about stalls that they put in this special software to counteract any potential stalls. And it would detect that through these angle of attack sensors. And from here, it gets really ugly. I mean, all well and good if it worked the way it was supposed to. And it turns out these aircraft, and this surprises me, have 2 of these angle of attack sensors. Frankly, if any plane I'm flying on should have a dozen of them, but never mind. They only had 2, but it turns out in the expedient of getting the software into production and onto the airplanes for reasons that have never been explained, that MCAS software only took input from one of the 2 sensors instead of comparing the 2. And this is one of the fatal modeling mistakes. Single point of failure, it's called. And this is a no-no. In aviation design, there is never supposed to be a single point of failure. Everything should be redundant. There should always be backups because so many lives are dependent on it. If the hydraulics fail, there has to be a backup way to control the aircraft. If the engines fail, etc. But this software received input, as I said, from only one of the 2 AOA sensors, unlike all the other versions. And the way it worked in the previous versions of the plane, that the software would compare inputs from these 2 AOA sensors. By the way, these are just weather vanes. I mean, they couldn't cost more than $1,000. All they do is tell which way the wind is blowing relative to the aircraft. And it measures the angle of attack. And if the angle of attack is too high, it indicates the conditions for a stall. These systems on previous plane were designed to compare the 2 angle of attack sensors. And if there was serious disagreement between the 2, it would basically disconnect itself and notify the pilot to take control of the plane. For the 737 MAX, in the rush to get these planes into production, into the air, for reason that they didn't apparently want to add that extra logic to compare the 2 sensors. I'm speculating on that. But the fact is that it only took input from one sensor. And if that sensor was faulty, disaster could occur. It was designed to detect stall conditions based on input, as I said. And it used flight parameters such as airspeed and altitude. In such a circumstance, an undocumented feature would deflect the horizontal elevator at the rear of the plane, which controls the pitch of the nose, by a maximum of 0.6 degrees from dead center. MCAS, and this is important, this line in yellow, MCAS was intended to be activated only at cruising speed. So we're talking 400 to 500 miles an hour. That 0.6 degrees at that speed would have a dramatic effect on lifting the nose of the plane. Boeing engineers estimated MCAS would only be activated once for every 100,000 hours of flight time and considered the associated risk to be minimal. So much for their risk calculations, but then they didn't know that MCAS was only reading input from one sensor. And by the way, if you notice, those angle attack weather vanes stick out from the fuselage, so they're easily damaged by any kind of moving object. Any luggage trains that brush by can damage them. It's not an uncommon event for those weather vanes to be bent. Boeing's senior test pilot became concerned about some flight instabilities he observed that could possibly cause a stall condition at lower landing speeds. So the Boeing engineers settled on a quick fix. Does this sound familiar? They would enable MCAS for low speed activation. This also meant they had to quadruple the angle of downward deflection on the horizontal elevator from 0.6 to a maximum of 2.4 degrees. This was because at low speeds, a larger deflection is required to achieve the same effect on nose pitch. Nobody stopped to think about what would happen if this occurs at cruising speeds. They just were in a rush to get this thing working and to take care of any low speed occurrences. Knowing that Boeing considered what would happen if this MCAS became activated at cruising speeds, thus a single untested last minute modification of the MCAS software cost over 300 lives and has brought Boeing to the brink of bankruptcy. So this is a glaring example of the importance of model risk management. The software was not tested, it was not documented. The FAA was not even notified of its existence, nor were the pilots trained in how to deactivate this system because Boeing thought it would probably never be used. And by the way, if they had told the FAA about this new MCAS software, it would require another 6 months delay because they would have to then train all their pilots. Every airline would have to go through simulator training for the pilots to show them how to work with this new MCAS software. Much easier to slip it on the carpet. And this sounds like the Vasa, by the way, slipping something under the carpet. So that's where I'm going with this presentation. Finally, let's compare the Vasa and the 737 MAX disasters and search for some common elements. Both the Vasa and the Boeing 737 MAX were developed on a rush schedule to meet new market demands. As a result, shortcuts were taken and testing was superficial or passed over altogether. Last-minute design changes were made while these crafts were being constructed. It was true in 1628, it was true in 2017. Little or no consideration was given to how the changes would impact stability in the rush to market. Stability testing performed by the Vice Admiral of the Swedish Navy on the Vasa and the senior test pilot for Boeing both indicated some serious control problems. These concerns were ignored in the interest of getting the Vasa into the water and the 737 MAX into the air on an accelerated schedule. No one involved in 1628 or 2018 was willing to raise their hand and claim that the crafts were unsafe and that launching should be delayed. Success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. The result was disaster in 1628, and again, a much worse disaster in 2018 and 19. While our technology may have advanced dramatically since the 17th century, our psychology has not. And as Monsieur Carr observed 170 years ago, the more things change, the more they remain the same. I'm going to prove that. In fact, we really haven't changed much over the last 35,000 years. Human psychology, cultural mores, behaviors, none of this has changed significantly since the last ice age or even earlier. And to support this claim, I'm going to offer two singular examples submitted as evidence. There are many ways of proving this, by the way, but this is my way. I'm going to show you two examples to show that we really have not changed very much. This is a photograph of 35,000-year-old handprints from the Chauvet Cave of southeastern France. It's called the Cave of Forgotten Dreams in a documentary by Werner Hart. So it's really fascinating. What's fascinating about this is these are very recognizable human hands. And the people who inhabited this cave obviously had a reason for putting these handprints on the wall. And what would that reason be? Well, I think I know. Our ancient ancestors left a record of the handprints because they wanted us to know of their existence. And I think this cartoon brings it home. If you see the cartoon in the middle, for people to believe we existed, they'll need some kind of proof, right? Do I have to do all the thinking around here? That's why we draw things on the cave wall, so people will know we existed. Well, I'm going to now give you my exhibit B and my way of proving that we haven't changed. And this is a photograph taken from a boulevard in Los Angeles that I think you'll immediately recognize. Yeah, this is the Walk of Fame in Hollywood. Hand and foot impressions are left on a street in contemporary Los Angeles. We're still doing this. In 35,000 years, what improvements have we made? Well, we figured out how to put footprints in there as well, because apparently those cave dwellers never figured out how to get their feet up onto a vertical wall. Oh, and we've learned how to write our names too. And that's it. We are still the same people. And that's my point. We haven't changed at all. But the implication for the future is, well, it needs to be understood. As our technology evolves towards greater complexity, we will become increasingly dependent on the software that controls our homes, cars, aircraft, and spacecraft, and therefore increasingly exposed to model risk. As we've learned, all models are wrong at some level of precision, and therefore model risk cannot be completely eliminated. So we really haven't changed. However, model risk can be mitigated to some extent, and the first step to mitigation is to identify and understand the root causes of model risk, and that is why this study of the curious history of model risk in human affairs can be useful. This is why I put this together, why I present it, to show that it affects every part of human activity, not just finance. So, sadly, there are many more such examples, and most of them were avoidable. Model risk is inherent and can't be eliminated, but we can control it when we understand it. And now I can open this to any questions, answers, and discussion, although this is a recording. Marc, do you have anything?
Yeah. I just wanted to say this is absolutely fantastic, John. I think it's just amazing how you went through all of history and you were able to find out some really fun A lot of funny ones. I really enjoyed the one from Galway Bay, but it's just so fascinating to look at Vasa and then the Boeing crisis and look at how things were rushed into production. Testing was incomplete and they pushed forward anyway. And these are things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. The things that still happen within banks and organizations today. And so it's just really fascinating to hear the echoes of history and how kind of incredible it is that we're still running into the same kinds of problems, just with very, very different pieces of technology, right? Instead of, ships and it's planes now, and instead of,
The technology has advanced, but we have not.
yeah, it's just
I'm reminded of a quote from
really,
Arnold.
really fascinating.
There's a quote from Arnold Toynbee, a historian, who said that the only thing we learn from history is that we never learn anything from history. And you see this being demonstrated again and again. It's that rush into production. And I deliberately did not pick any examples from finance, but there are plenty. And certainly the London whale debacle at JP Morgan in 2012, the perfect example, because they're a major risk model, which was full of mistakes and flaws, was rushed into production without any testing because the traders needed to get their VAR numbers down so they could try to dig out of a hole. So that's a classic example of the same thing happening in finance. But in finance, the only thing we lose is money and reputation and careers, perhaps, but lives are not lost. This is actually far more important when you're talking about spacecraft and aircraft, when lives are in the balance and engineers don't do what they need to do to ensure that the software they put on these devices is been fully tested and validated. And I've never been able to find out what kind of program Boeing has for ensuring the quality of their software, but I suspect they don't come up to the standards that we use in finance. And so it is my thought that these other industries would do well to take a lesson from what we've learned since 2008 about recognizing, managing, and mitigating model risk. And if they could institute the same kind of procedures we use under SR 11.7, this very rigorous independent replication, for instance, if that MCAS software had been independently replicated and tested side by side with the production software in a simulator, a good validation team would have spotted those problems.
Right.
But that would have taken more time, of course. It would have taken weeks or months. And they were in a rush because Airbus was also coming into the market with a similar plane around the same time. And as always, profit motives seem to always trump safety and security, despite the denials. That CEO from Boeing wanted to assure everybody that passenger safety was their #1 priority, which was just basically not true. Well, he's no longer the CEO, but yeah, thanks for your remarks. And I would like to invite anyone who has other examples of this to please share them with me. You can find me on LinkedIn, and the first slide has my email address as well. But I just love collecting these examples, and I've added 2 more just this year from friends and contacts who've discovered these little gems of history. And I weave them into my narrative if they fit well. So that example of the submarine that couldn't float was the latest one that I learned about through a friend who also works in model risk.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, John, thank you so much for this real treat here. This is kind of a real fun look into the history of model risk, and just kind of funny how our models have evolved, but somehow we still haven't. And really, really good call out to the importance of model risk in multiple domains across industries, and for everyone in kind of this growing world that we're going into of advancing models across all these different domains. So John, thank you so much for your time. And I'll make sure to get your LinkedIn and your contact information in the show notes that other folks can reach out to you.
That's great. Thanks very much for hosting me, Mark. I really appreciate this opportunity too. I love giving this. This is my favorite lecture, as you can imagine, because it's just fun and it's entertaining and colorful too. But I think it drives home the point of how important model risk is.
Absolutely.